The chair was hard, not the kind of hard that made you shift once or twice and find a better angle, the kind of hard that meant no one expected you to stay long. Caroline Webb had been sitting in it for 40 minutes before she stopped checking the time. Not because she had given up, because she had made a decision. The moment she stopped watching the clock was the moment she started watching everything else, and there was a great deal to watch. The reception area of Harmon Capital Group occupied the entire 43rd floor of a glass building in the middle of the city. It was the kind of space designed to communicate one thing very clearly: power lives here. The marble floors reflected the ceiling lights. The furniture was all sharp angles and pale wood, and the kind of fabric that cost more than most people's rent. There were no magazines on the low tables. There was no music playing. There were no warm touches anywhere, not a plant, not a painting that showed anything resembling a human emotion. Just clean lines and controlled air and the faint, steady hum of a building full of people who believed they were important. Caroline had walked into spaces like this her whole life. She had learned something early that most people figure out too late. The design of a room tells you everything about the people who built it, and the way those people treat someone in a waiting chair tells you even more. She had arrived at 9:48. Her appointment had been at 10. She had given herself 12 minutes, which was enough to find parking, cross the lobby, take the elevator, sign in at the front desk, and settle in without appearing rushed. She was never rushed. Rushing was something that happened to people who had not planned properly. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire according to the small nameplate on the desk, had smiled at her the way people smile when they are performing a function rather than expressing a feeling. She had taken Caroline's name, typed something into her computer, nodded, and said that someone would be with her shortly. Shortly was a word that meant nothing. Caroline knew this. She had said it herself 1,000 times in her career, usually when the honest answer was either 15 minutes or I have no idea. Shortly was the professional word for please, don't ask me to be specific. She had sat down. She had placed her portfolio on her lap. She had not taken out her phone. That was the thing people noticed first, though none of them would have been able to say exactly when they started noticing it. In a waiting room full of people who were all looking at screens, she was the only one looking at the room. Not in an aggressive way. Not in the way of someone who was annoyed or bored or trying to make a point. Just quietly observant, in the way of someone who has trained herself to gather information from everything around her. 40 minutes passed. A man in a navy suit came through the glass doors that separated the waiting area from the inner offices. He was in his early 30s, moving fast, talking to someone on a wireless earpiece. He did not look at her. He collected a visitor from the far end of the waiting area, a man who had arrived 20 minutes after Caroline, and led him through the glass doors with the kind of energy that said this person matters. Follow me. The glass doors closed. Caroline watched them go. She noted the time in her head. She said nothing. 15 minutes later, another assistant came through. Different face, same energy. She collected a woman in a gray blazer who had been sitting near the windows for less than 10 minutes. The gray blazer woman gave Caroline a small, apologetic look as she passed, the way people do when they realize they have been given something the person who arrived before them has not. Caroline smiled at her, genuinely. It was not the other woman's fault. It was not even interesting. It was simply data. Her coffee, which she had bought from the cart in the lobby because no one had offered to get her anything, was cooling in her left hand. She had taken 3 sips from it since she sat down. She was not going to drink more. She was not going to throw it away. She was going to keep it in her hand because it gave her hand something to do, and because she had learned that a person holding a cup looks settled, and looking settled in a room that wants you to feel small is one of the quieter forms of resistance. She had grown up learning resistance in quiet forms. Her father had owned a hardware store in a small town in the Midlands, not a chain, not a franchise, An actual hardware store with wooden shelves and handwritten price tags and her father's name above the door. She had worked there from the age of 11, learning how to talk to every kind of person who walked in. The contractors who came in knowing exactly what they needed. The first-time homeowners who had no idea. The ones who looked at a 12-year-old girl behind the counter and immediately asked if there was a man they could speak to. She had learned to handle all of them. The business degree came later. Then the early jobs, the ones that paid almost nothing and taught her almost everything. Then the slow, methodical building of something that was entirely hers. No investor had given it to her. No wealthy family member had written a check. She had started Web Capital Solutions from a desk in a shared office space with 2 employees and 1 client. And she had spent the next 14 years turning it into something that, at this particular moment in time, had $500 million available to place with the right partner. Harmon Capital Group had spent 4 months telling her they were the right partner. She was here today to decide whether they were correct. No one in this waiting room knew that. She had chosen not to announce herself beyond her name. She had not mentioned her company. She had not brought a colleague or an assistant of her own. She had come alone, with the portfolio and the coffee and the chair that was too hard, and she had been waiting for an hour and 20 minutes when the assistant finally came back. Not to take her through the glass doors, to check on her. His name was probably written on a nameplate somewhere, but he was not wearing one, and he did not introduce himself. He was young, somewhere in his mid-20s, with the slightly elevated posture of someone who had recently been given a title that felt large to him. He came to stand in front of her with the careful, managed expression of someone delivering news they expect to be unwelcome. He told her the CEO was still tied up. He used those exact words, tied up, as though the CEO had been caught somewhere against his will, as though it was not a choice to remain wherever he was. Caroline looked at him calmly. She said she understood. He waited for her to say something else. She did not. He offered to reschedule. He said it in a way that was meant to sound helpful, but carried underneath it the implication that rescheduling was the sensible option, the gracious option, the option that would save everyone some awkwardness. She told him she would wait. A small pause. He nodded. He offered water. She had already declined water once when she first arrived. She declined it again. He gestured, almost involuntarily, toward a smaller hallway off to the left, and mentioned that there was a quieter conference room she could use if she preferred somewhere more comfortable. She looked at the hallway. She looked at the conference room he was indicating, which was glass-walled and small and tucked away from the main corridor where people walked through. Then she looked back at him. She said she was quite comfortable where she was. He left. She stayed in the chair closest to the main corridor, where anyone moving through the building would see her, where her presence was visible, where the fact of her waiting was part of the landscape of the afternoon. This was not stubbornness. This was strategy. She had learned it from a woman named Grace Ackhaffer, who had been her first mentor and one of the sharpest thinkers she had ever encountered in any room in any city. Grace had told her once over dinner after a very long day that the most powerful thing a person can do when they are being underestimated is refuse to become invisible. Not loudly, not aggressively, just refuse. Stay in the light. Make them work around you. Make your presence a fact they cannot avoid. Caroline had never forgotten it. She thought about Grace now, sitting in the hard chair, holding the cold coffee, watching the afternoon light shift across the marble floor. She thought about the 4 months of calls and presentations and follow-up documents. The proposal Harmon Capital had sent her, expensively printed and personally delivered by a courier. The dinner they had organized at a restaurant she would not have chosen herself, attended by 3 senior partners who had been warm and attentive and full of carefully selected words. The site visits, the references. The accumulated effort of an organization doing what organizations do, when they believe there is something significant at stake. All of that, and then this chair. She had a theory about companies, which was that the version of them you encountered when they wanted something from you was not the real version. The real version was the one that appeared after they thought they had you, or the one that appeared when no one important was watching. She tested this theory whenever she could, and it had never failed her. An hour and 40 minutes, 2 hours, 2 hours and 15. She did not move from the chair. She did not take out her phone. She did not speak to anyone, and no one spoke to her. The receptionist, Claire, kept her eyes on her monitor, but Caroline noticed the slight, repeated glances, the small flicker of something that was not quite guilt but was in its neighborhood. Claire knew, probably, that this had gone on longer than it should have. She was too junior to do anything about it, and she knew that too. Other people came and went. The waiting room filled and emptied twice over. Caroline stayed. At 2 hours and 43 minutes after her scheduled appointment time, the glass doors opened, and the CEO of Harmon Capital Group walked through them. His name was Jeffrey Harmon. He had founded the company 19 years ago and had the confidence of a man who had spent 19 years being right more often than he was wrong. He was on a call when he came through the doors, laughing at something the person on the other end had said, and he moved through the reception area the way people do when they own the space they are moving through. He finished the call, lowered his phone, looked up. He saw a woman he did not recognize rising from one of the waiting chairs. She was holding a portfolio and a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting untouched for a very long time. She was calm in a way that was different from the calm of someone who had nothing on her mind. It was the calm of someone who had already finished thinking and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up. Jeffrey Harmon smiled. It was a very good smile. He had used it in a great many situations over a very long career. He began to say that he was sorry for the wait. Then he glanced at the young assistant beside him, looking for the visitor's name. She gave it herself: first name, last name, company name. 3 pieces of information, delivered without drama, in the same tone she might use to order from a menu. The smile did not disappear, but it changed. It became a different kind of smile, one that required more effort to maintain. Jeffrey Harmon was an intelligent man. He had not built what he built by being slow to understand things. He understood this very quickly. The assistant beside him understood it too, a half-second later, and the process of understanding moved through his face in a way that was almost painful to observe. Caroline watched both of them. She was still completely calm. She had been calm for 2 hours and 43 minutes, and she intended to remain so for the rest of the afternoon. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. She had been ready since she walked in. Jeffrey Harmon was a man who had built his entire reputation on the ability to recover. Every person who had ever worked for him, competed with him, or sat across a table from him in a negotiation could have told you that. It was not just charm, though he had plenty of that. It was a specific, trained capacity to absorb a setback and return to baseline so quickly that the people around him sometimes questioned whether the setback had actually occurred. He had done it in boardrooms. He had done it on earnings calls when the numbers were bad. He had done it in personal conversations that had gone sideways in ways he had not anticipated. He did it now. The shift in his expression lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the recovery came, smooth and practiced, and he extended his hand and said her name back to her, Caroline Webb, with the warmth of a man who had been expecting her all afternoon. She shook his hand. Her grip was firm, brief, and told him nothing. He gestured toward the glass doors. "Of course," he said. "Let us get you into a proper room." He used the word proper. She noticed it. Proper implied that what had come before was improper, which was accurate, but it was also the kind of word people use when they are apologizing without technically saying sorry. She followed him through the glass doors. The inner offices of Harmon Capital were exactly what she had expected from the waiting area. Everything was calibrated. The carpet absorbed sound. The light was warm and indirect. The walls held large abstract pieces that had been chosen by someone who understood that art in an office should suggest taste without demanding attention. People moved with purpose and spoke in measured tones. The whole floor felt like a machine that had been running long enough to believe it would run forever. Jeffrey walked quickly. 2 assistants fell into step behind them. One of them, she noticed, was already on a phone, speaking quietly, almost certainly making calls to the rooms she was about to enter to ensure those rooms were ready, ensuring that whatever had gone wrong in the front half of the afternoon would not be visible in the back half. She had seen this before. The scramble that happens when someone realizes the situation is more serious than they understood. The rapid, quiet coordination, the closing of gaps. The conference room they brought her to was large, with a long table and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked over the city. Someone had set out water and a small plate of things, pastries and fruit, arranged with the speed and precision of people who had done this same arrangement 1,000 times. There was fresh coffee in a glass carafe. She looked at the carafe, then at the cup she was still holding, the cold one she had bought herself from the lobby cart that morning. She set it down on the table. She did not pick up the new cup. Jeffrey sat across from her. 2 colleagues joined him, introduced with titles and names that she registered but did not need to write down. She had done her research on every senior person at Harmon Capital long before she had accepted the first meeting invitation. She knew who they were, what they had built, where they had been before this, and what their track record looked like in the years. The numbers were less flattering than the years they put in the brochure. She opened her portfolio. She placed 2 documents on the table. She aligned them neatly and then looked up. Jeffrey began the meeting the way he always began meetings. He took control of the room, which was a reflex as much as a strategy, and he opened with a summary of where they were in the process. He spoke about their shared history of conversations, the alignment he felt between their 2 organizations, the vision he had for what a partnership would look like. He was good at this. The words came easily, and they were, individually, true. They were simply also arranged in a way that moved the conversation forward without acknowledging the 2 hours and 43 minutes. She let him finish. Then she said something that a less experienced person would have held back. She said, very simply, that she wanted to spend some time today doing something different from the conversations they had been having. She said she wanted to talk about operations. Jeffrey nodded, a little carefully. She said she was interested in how Harmon Capital ran its day, not its strategy, not its vision. Its actual daily operation, the systems that governed how time was managed, how clients were prioritized, how the people who walked through the door were treated before anyone knew who they were. There was a pause. One of the colleagues shifted in his seat. Jeffrey said, of course, and began to describe their client relations process, their intake system, their team structure, the onboarding protocol for new partnerships. He was thorough and he was professional, and he did not once mention the waiting room. She listened to all of it. She asked questions, precise questions, the kind that required specific answers rather than general ones. She asked about turnaround times on client communications. She asked about escalation procedures when something went wrong. She asked about accountability structures, about who was responsible for what when a process failed, and what the consequence of that failure looked like internally. Jeffrey answered all of it. He was sharp. His answers were mostly good. In another meeting on another day, she might have found them impressive. But she was not evaluating the answers in isolation. She was evaluating them in the context of the afternoon. Because what a company describes about itself and what a company actually does are 2 entirely different things, and she had just spent nearly 3 hours watching what Harmon Capital actually did. They had looked at her, and seen someone who could wait. And she wanted to understand how that decision had been made, not to embarrass anyone, not to make a point in the room, but because a company that makes that kind of mistake in its waiting area makes the same kind of mistake in its conference rooms and in its contracts and in its communications at 2 in the morning when a market moves and a client calls and the person who answers decides, in a fraction of a second, who on the other end of the line is worth the urgency. These were not separate things. They never were. She had learned this from experience, not from business school. She had learned it in the years when she was the person in the waiting room not as a test, but as a reality, when she had genuinely been unknown, when she had walked into rooms where the assumption of her unimportance was not a test of the organization, but simply the truth of where she was in her career. She had watched in those years how different organizations handled the unknown, how some of them had processes that treated everyone with the same baseline of respect regardless of what they knew or did not know about the person in front of them, and how others operated on a hierarchy of perceived value that was invisible when things were going well and catastrophic when they were not. She had kept a list in those years, not a formal list, a mental one. Harmon Capital had just put themselves on it. Jeffrey was talking about their technology infrastructure now, the system they used for client communications. She listened. She asked about the system's failure rate and whether there were manual overrides for time-sensitive situations. He said yes, of course. She asked who controlled the override. He named a title. She asked whether the person who held that title had been in the building today. He said yes. She made a small note in the portfolio. She did not share what she had written. Across the table, she could feel the temperature of the room changing. Not dramatically. Jeffrey Harmon was too experienced to let it show dramatically. But the two colleagues who had come in with him were less practiced, and their body language had shifted from the easy confidence they had carried when they sat down to something tighter, something more careful, something that looked like people who are trying to understand the shape of a problem without yet being sure what the problem is. She understood this too. She had sat on their side of the table. She knew what it felt like to realize, partway through a meeting, that the meeting was not going the way you had believed it was going. She did not make it harder than it needed to be. She did not perform anything. She simply continued to ask her questions, listen to the answers, and write small notes that no one else could see. At one point, Jeffrey's assistant appeared at the door and leaned in to say something quietly to one of the colleagues. The colleague looked at the assistant, then at Jeffrey, and made the smallest possible nod. She did not know exactly what had been said, but she knew the shape of it. Someone had done a search. Someone had finally looked her up. Whatever information that search had produced was now moving through the room in real time, adjusting the air, changing the calculation that everyone on Jeffrey's side of the table was running. She had expected this. She had expected it to happen eventually. She had simply expected it to happen before her appointment, not 1 hour into it. She waited for Jeffrey to acknowledge it. He did not directly. What he did was lean forward slightly, the unconscious physical adjustment of a person who has just recalibrated how seriously they need to be taking something. His voice, which had been warm and measured, became warmer, more present. The particular quality of attention he was giving her shifted from the attention. A CEO gives a courtesy, meeting to the attention. A CEO gives something that genuinely matters. It was, objectively, the right response. It was also too late to mean what it would have meant at 10 o'clock in the morning. She had built her entire company on a single principle that she had never written down anywhere and never spoken aloud in any formal setting, because it did not need to be said in any formal setting. It only needed to be lived. The principle was this: the way someone treats you before they know what you are worth is the truest information you will ever have about them. Not because it reveals malice. Most people who behave badly in this way are not malicious. They are operating on assumption. They are moving through a world that has taught them, accurately enough, that some people matter more than others, and they have built reflexes around that teaching that operate without much conscious thought. Those reflexes are real. They are consistent. They will not disappear because a situation has become uncomfortable. She had seen this play out in 14 years of building. She had watched organizations charm her when she had money to give and disappear when she needed something from them. She had watched individuals treat her with perfect courtesy in formal settings and complete indifference in informal ones. She had watched companies perform values they did not hold and hold values they did not perform, and she had learned, slowly and with considerable cost, how to tell the difference. The difference was not in what people said. It was in what they did when no one they considered important was watching. 3/4 of the way through the meeting, Jeffrey made his move. It was a good move. She appreciated the intelligence of it. He stopped talking about processes and systems and turned to the future. He talked about where he saw the market going. He talked about the specific instruments he believed were undervalued. He talked about 2 situations in the previous year where his team had acted against the general consensus and been proven right by a margin that the numbers still clearly showed. He talked with the conviction and the precision of a man who genuinely knew what he was doing when he was doing the thing he was best at. She listened carefully. She asked follow-up questions. She pressed on the 2 specific situations he mentioned, asked about the decision-making process, the timeline, the point at which they had committed before they knew the outcome. His answers were excellent. She wrote more notes. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved in the way cities move in the middle of a working afternoon, indifferent and continuous. She had a meeting in another building at 4:30. She had made arrangements for it when she confirmed this appointment, building in a buffer she had expected not to need. She was going to need most of it now. The meeting ran to just past 3. At 3:07 she closed her portfolio. She said she appreciated the time. She thanked each person at the table by name. Her manner was warm, professional, and gave nothing away, which was, she knew, both true to who she was and entirely functional in this moment. Jeffrey walked her out personally. In the corridor away from his colleagues, he said something that surprised her slightly. He said he knew today had not gone as planned, not as an apology exactly, more as an acknowledgement, a statement of shared fact. She looked at him. She said she understood that these things happened. He said he hoped it would not affect her thinking. She said that her thinking was always based on the full picture. He nodded slowly. He was a smart man. He understood what a full picture meant in this context. At the elevator, he shook her hand again. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors opened immediately, and she stepped inside, and she turned to face the closing gap, and the last thing she saw before the doors met was Jeffrey Harmon standing in the corridor, watching her go, with the expression of a man who has just understood something he cannot undo. She had seen that expression before, on different faces, in different buildings, in different cities. It never got easier to see. But it never surprised her either. The elevator descended. She looked straight ahead at the closed doors. She thought about the coffee she had left on the conference table, the cold one from the lobby cart, sitting in its place among the carafes and the carefully arranged plates. She had left it there on purpose. Not as a dramatic gesture, not to make a point that anyone in the room would consciously register, just because precision mattered to her. What she left behind and what she took with her were not accidents. The lobby appeared. She walked through it. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving forward, indifferent, full of buildings, full of people making decisions and living with them. She had a decision of her own to finish making. She walked to the corner, turned left and found her car. She set the portfolio on the passenger seat. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine off, not thinking. She had already done the thinking, just being still for a moment before the next thing. Then she started the car. She had another meeting to get to. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby of a different building, smaller and quieter than the one she had left an hour ago, and Caroline Webb walked out of them into a space that felt, immediately, different. She had been in hundreds of offices in her career. She had walked into spaces that were designed to intimidate, spaces designed to impress, spaces designed to communicate stability or creativity or tradition or disruption. She had learned to read them the way other people read faces. This one was designed to be useful. The lobby had good light, natural light coming from a bank of windows that had not been tinted or filtered into submission. The furniture was simple and well-made without being expensive in a way that announced itself. There was a plant near the door, a real one, something green and living that someone was clearly taking care of. The floor was clean. The air was the right temperature. At the front desk, a man in his 30s stood up when she came through the door. He came around the desk to greet her, not as a performance but as a habit. His name, he said, was Oliver Grant, and he was the operations manager, and he had been expecting her at 4:30, and it was 4:26, and could he get her anything while she waited for Nathan to come down? She said she was fine. She thanked him. He smiled at her, the kind of smile that reaches a person's eyes and does not require maintenance, and he showed her to a seating area near the windows where the light was best. He did not put her in a corner. He did not point her toward a smaller room down a hallway. He showed her to the best seat in the space and offered it to her the way you offer the best seat to someone whose time matters. She sat down. Exactly 4 minutes later, Nathan Cole came through a door at the far end of the lobby. Nathan Cole was 41 years old and had founded Cole Investment Partners 11 years ago with a background in fixed-income markets and a reputation, which she had spent 3 weeks verifying through people who were not on his company's approved reference list, for being the same in difficult situations as he was in easy ones. He was not as polished as Jeffrey Harmon. He did not move through a room with the same easy command. He was slightly too fast, slightly too direct, the kind of person who had ideas before he had finished hearing the question, and who had learned over years to manage that tendency rather than eliminate it, because eliminating it would have required eliminating the thing that made him good. She had done thorough work on Nathan Cole. He came across the lobby with his hand out before he was close enough to shake, the reflex of someone who is genuinely glad to see the person they are walking toward. He said her name. He said he was glad she had made the time. She shook his hand and said it was good to meet him in person. He led her not to the large conference room, which she could see at the end of a corridor, its glass walls empty and waiting, but to a smaller office with a round table. He said he preferred round tables for first conversations. It was easier to think, he said. He was aware that was an odd thing to say in what was technically a business meeting, and he said so, with a brief self-aware laugh, and then he said that he found honesty about odd preferences saved a great deal of time overall. She told him she agreed. She opened her portfolio. He had his own notes in a folder. They began. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 12 minutes. She asked him many of the same questions she had asked Jeffrey Harmon that morning, about operations, about accountability, about what happened inside the organization when a process failed. He answered all of them without hesitation, but more than that, he answered them with specificity. Not general descriptions of systems and philosophies, but actual examples, situations. What happened, what went wrong, who was responsible, what changed afterward. He talked about a situation 3 years ago when a communication failure on his team's side had cost a client 2 weeks of decision time during a period when 2 weeks mattered. He described what that failure had looked like, how they had discovered it, and what he had personally done in response. He named the specific process change that had come from it and told her it was still in place today and that she was welcome to verify it. She noted the word welcome, not the performance of transparency, the actual offer of it. Partway through, Oliver Grant knocked quietly and came in with 2 cups of coffee, freshly made, and set them on the table without interrupting the conversation. He left the same way he had come. Nathan thanked him without breaking the sentence he was in. She noticed the naturalness of it, the ease, the way a small act of consideration moved through the room without requiring acknowledgement or credit. She thought about the morning. She thought about the lobby cart, the cold cup, the chair too hard to be comfortable, the assistant with the elevated posture who had suggested the small room down the hallway. She thought about the accumulated wait of 2 hours and 43 minutes. She drank the coffee Nathan's team had made for her. It was good. At 6:12 she closed her portfolio. She told Nathan she appreciated his time and his directness. She said she had one final question, which was not a financial question. He told her to ask it. She said, if something went wrong 6 months into a working relationship and the error was on her side, not his, what would that look like from where he was sitting? Not the professional response, the actual one. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, actually thinking, not reaching for an answer but looking for an honest one. He said he would be frustrated. He said he would want to understand what happened before he decided what to do about it. He said he had ended relationships over errors before, not because the error itself was unforgivable, but because the response to the error had revealed something about the other party that the relationship could not survive. And he said he had also stayed in relationships through significant difficulties, because the response to the error had shown him something that made him want to stay. He said he thought the response to difficulty was the most important information you could get about anyone. She looked at him. She thought about Jeffrey Harmon standing in the corridor outside the elevator, watching her go, and about 2 hours and 43 minutes, and about the cold cup of coffee she had left on a conference table in a building 20 minutes north of here. She said she thought Nathan was right. She picked up her portfolio. She said she would be in touch within the week. He walked her out himself. At the door, he said it had been a pleasure, and it sounded like something he actually meant. Outside, the evening had come into the city while they were talking. The light was different now, softer and lower, and the streets were doing what streets did in the early evening, filling with people who were somewhere between where they had been and where they were going. She stood on the pavement for a moment. She thought about a principle she had never written down. She had carried it for so long it had become part of how she breathed, part of how she walked into rooms, part of how she asked the first question and then waited to hear the second one, the one that came in the answer, the one the person on the other side of the table did not know they were giving. The way someone treats you before they know what you are worth is the truest information you will ever have about them. She had walked into 2 buildings today. She had been made to wait in one and welcomed in the other. She had asked the same questions in both. She had listened to the same category of answers. But the answers had been different, not in their content, in their origin. One set of answers had come from a place of managing her impression. The other had come from a place of simply telling her the truth. She could feel the difference. She had always been able to feel it. That was, in the end, the skill that had mattered most. She walked to her car. She placed the portfolio on the passenger seat again, in the same position it had been in when she parked. She sat for a moment. Then she took out her phone. She did not make a call. She opened a document, a private one, that no one else had access to. At the top of the document was a heading she had written 14 years ago, when she first understood what she was building and why it required her to be careful about who she built it with. Below the heading was a list. She added one name to it, and then she closed the document, and she started the car, and she drove away from the building where someone had been glad she was coming. The week after a decision like this one does not feel the way people on the outside imagine it feels. It does not feel triumphant. It does not feel like a conclusion. It feels mostly like work. The particular kind of work that comes after a long period of evaluation, when the thinking is done and the doing begins, and the doing is specific and technical, and requires the same quality of attention that the thinking did, just directed at different things. Caroline Webb spent the Monday following her 2 meetings on calls with her legal team, her senior analyst, and one trusted colleague named Patricia Holt, who had known her since the early years and whose instincts about people she trusted more than almost anyone else she had ever met. Patricia did not need the whole story. She needed the relevant facts. Caroline gave them. Patricia said, without hesitation, that she would have done the same thing. The legal team began drafting. The analyst began running the final numbers on Cole Investment Partners, not because the numbers were in question, but because thoroughness was non-negotiable, because $500 million was a real sum with real consequences, and because the people whose money it represented deserved to have every available door checked before it was closed. Every door checked, every number confirmed. This was not new behavior for Caroline. It was simply the current version of the same behavior she had brought to every decision she had ever made. On Tuesday, she received an email from Jeffrey Harmon. It arrived at 8:47 in the morning. She saw it when she came to her desk after a meeting that had run over. The subject line was a single word: follow up. She opened it. The email was well written. Jeffrey Harmon was, among other things, a person who knew how to write an email. It acknowledged that the previous week's meeting had not gone as intended. It used the phrase "on our end," which was precise enough to constitute an admission without actually naming the thing it was admitting. It spoke about their ongoing admiration for what she had built. It referenced 3 specific elements of Webb Capital Solutions that were, she noted, things anyone could have found in a 10-minute search. It closed with an invitation to continue the conversation at her convenience and on her terms. Her terms, those 2 words had been chosen carefully. She could feel the choosing of them. She read the email twice, then she closed it without responding. This was not strategy. She was not holding the response for effect. She genuinely did not know yet what she wanted to say, and she had learned long ago that the time to speak is after you know what you mean, not before. She thought about Jeffrey's email on and off throughout Tuesday, not with bitterness and not with satisfaction, with the measured attention she gave to anything that required a response. She thought about what the email was asking for beneath its carefully chosen words, and about whether the thing it was asking for was something she was prepared to give. On Wednesday morning, Nathan Cole sent a brief note through his assistant. It said that he had enjoyed their conversation and that his team had prepared a short supplemental document addressing a few of the technical questions they had not had time to get to fully. The document was attached. It was not a pitch. It was not a persuasion. It was an answer to questions she had asked, delivered without flourish. She read the document that morning. It was thorough. It was honest about one specific limitation she had not even raised, a capacity constraint that would affect the timeline of their first 6 months of working together. The document named the constraint, explained its source, and described the plan to address it, with a realistic timeline that she could verify independently. She read that section twice. She thought about the principle again. Not as a reminder, just the way certain true things move through your mind when you encounter evidence of them. She forwarded the document to her analyst. The analysis came back by end of day. The numbers held. The capacity constraint was real but manageable. The plan to address it was credible. On Thursday, she responded to Nathan's note. She thanked him for the document. She said her team had reviewed it and she had one follow-up question. The question was specific, technical, and required a careful answer. He called her within the hour. They spoke for 22 minutes. He answered the question. He introduced a colleague who handled the relevant technical area, who answered a clarifying question from her analyst. Everything held. She told him she would be in touch. On Thursday evening, she replied to Jeffrey Harmon. The reply was short. She thanked him for his note. She said she appreciated his candor. She said she had given the matter full consideration and had decided to pursue another direction for this investment. She wished Harmon Capital well and said she hoped their paths would cross again professionally. She did not explain. She did not enumerate her reasons. She did not, in any way, describe the chair or the coffee or the 2 hours and 43 minutes. She had not done this to make a point. She had done it because it was the right decision for the money she was responsible for. The point was incidental. The rightness of the decision was not. She sent the email. She closed her laptop. She went to make herself a cup of tea in the small kitchen off her office, and she stood at the window for a while looking at the city. She thought about her father's hardware store, about the wooden shelves and the handwritten price tags, about the customers who would not speak to a 12-year-old girl and would not look at a 43-year-old woman until they understood what she was worth, about the ones who had spoken to her and looked at her before they understood any of that, simply because she was a person in front of them, and that was enough of a reason. She had been building, all her professional life, toward a position where the people who had dismissed her could not afford to. She had reached that position. And what she had discovered, on reaching it, was that the satisfaction of it was much smaller than she had expected, and the responsibility of it was much larger. Because the money she now managed was not hers. It belonged to the people who had trusted her with it. Some of them were institutions. Some were individuals, people who had worked for decades and set aside what they could and placed it in her hands because they believed she would protect it and grow it with the same care they would have if they had the knowledge she had. She felt the weight of that every day. It was not an uncomfortable weight. It was a clarifying one. Every decision she made ran through it, not just the financial decisions but the partnership decisions, because a bad partner did not just cost returns. A bad partner cost trust, and trust, once broken in this industry, did not return. She had learned that the hard way early. She had not forgotten it. The tea was done. She carried it back to her desk and sat down. There were 3 more items on her list for the evening. She worked through them steadily, without rush, and was done by 8. On Friday morning, she signed the preliminary agreement with Cole Investment Partners. She signed it in her own office, at her own desk, with her own pen, the same pen she had used to sign every significant document in the history of her company. Her assistant witnessed it. 2 members of her legal team were on a video call to confirm receipt on their end. It was a quiet process, no celebration, no ceremony. Just the clean, careful execution of a decision that had been properly made. Nathan Cole called an hour later. He said he was genuinely glad. He said his team was ready. He asked one practical question about the timeline for the first transfer and confirmed the point of contact on her side. She answered. She confirmed. She said she was looking forward to working together. He said, before hanging up, that he had one thing he wanted to tell her. He said it had nothing to do with the contract. He said she was free to disregard it entirely if she chose. She told him to say it. He said that in his experience, the clients who asked the questions she had asked in the way she had asked them were always the ones the work was best with, not because they were easier, because they were honest. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she appreciated him saying so. They ended the call. She sat at her desk for a moment. Through the window of her office she could see the same city she had looked at through the window of the conference room on the 43rd floor 5 days ago. It looked the same. It always looked the same from a distance. The difference was always in the detail, in the grain of things, in what you found when you got close enough to look. She had always known how to look. She opened the document on her phone, the private one. At the top, the heading she had written 14 years ago, below it the list. She found the name she had added 5 days ago, Jeffrey Harmon's company, and she left it where it was. Then she scrolled to a different section, one she kept separately, and she added a new entry. The name she added was Nathan Cole. Then she closed the document and put her phone face down on the desk and got back to work. The morning was still young. There was a great deal to do. The thing about a decision that changes the course of $500 million is that it does not announce itself. It does not come with a statement or a press release or a carefully timed revelation. It happens in the ordinary way that most consequential things happen, quietly, in offices, through signed documents and confirmed bank transfers and the unremarkable daily work of people who have agreed to do something together and are now doing it. The news, when it reached the industry, arrived in fragments. First, a small note in a financial trade publication, not a headline, a brief item in the back pages, the kind that people who subscribe to the publication for its headlines often miss entirely. It mentioned that Web Capital Solutions had finalized a significant new partnership with Cole Investment Partners. It named the figure. It did not name the alternative. Second, the conversations that happen in the margins of conferences, over coffee between sessions, or in the hallways between panels. Snippets. Someone had heard something. A colleague of a colleague had been in a meeting where Harman Capital had not come up the way it usually did. The specific texture of professional gossip, which is never quite accurate and never entirely wrong. Third, and this was the one that traveled farthest, the version that passed between junior analysts and mid-level managers, and eventually worked its way into the formal discussions of more than one firm's internal review. The story. The story that moved through the industry in the weeks after was not accurate in all its details. Stories rarely are by the time they have passed through enough hands. Some versions of it had the wrong figure. Some had the timeline wrong. Some had embellishments that had accumulated in the passing, the way stories do. But the core of it held. In every version, a woman had sat in a waiting room for hours. In every version, the company that had made her wait had not known who she was. In every version, she had walked away. The version that became most widely repeated had a line at the end, attributed to someone who had allegedly been in the building that day, who had allegedly been told by someone who was in the conference room, who had allegedly been told by someone who was there. The line was, "She left a cold coffee on the table and did not say goodbye." Caroline had, in fact, said goodbye, politely, professionally, as she always did. But the cold coffee was accurate. She heard the story herself about 3 weeks after the signing. She heard it from Patricia Holt, who had been at a conference and overheard someone telling a version of it with considerable enthusiasm to a small group in a hotel lobby. Patricia told her over the phone, and Caroline could hear the particular quality of Patricia's silence at the end of the telling, which was the silence of someone waiting to find out how the actual person involved in a story feels about the version that has escaped into the world. Caroline told her it was mostly right. Patricia laughed, then she asked how Caroline felt about it. Caroline thought about it for a moment. She said she did not love the idea of her name being in stories she could not control. She said she understood that this was part of the consequence of operating at a certain scale, and that she had known it for a long time, and that understanding it did not make it entirely comfortable. And then she said something that Patricia would quote back to her years later, in a different context, when a different version of the same situation was relevant. She said, "I did not go to that building to make a point. I went to get information. The information I got was accurate. What anyone does with that story is their own business. What I did with that information was mine." Patricia said she thought that was right. Then she said, because she had known Caroline long enough to say it, "I know you. You knew before you walked in." Caroline was quiet. Patricia said, "You already knew before the appointment. You had already decided. You went anyway." Caroline said, "Yes." Patricia said, "Why?" This was the question she had not been asked before, not directly, not by someone who knew her well enough that the honest answer was required. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, because I wanted them to know that I knew, not the people in that room, not Jeffrey specifically. The situation. I wanted the situation to be named, even if no one said it out loud, even if only I knew what was being named. She paused. She said, there are rooms you walk out of and no one learns anything. And there are rooms you walk out of, and the fact that you walked out is the lesson, even if no one frames it that way. I have been in that waiting chair in a different way, a real way, for a long time. I wanted to walk out of the room correctly, for the version of me that could not. Patricia did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, I think you did. The weeks after the signing were full. They were always full. The operational work of a new partnership at this scale involved a volume of detail that most people outside the industry did not fully appreciate. There were structures to confirm and timelines to establish and internal communications to align, and 100 small decisions that accumulated into the shape of how two organizations would work together going forward. Nathan Cole's team was, in all of this, exactly what she had assessed them to be. They were direct. When they did not know something, they said so and then found out. When something moved more slowly than the original timeline had specified, they communicated the delay early enough for her team to adjust rather than late enough that the adjustment was difficult. When there was a disagreement, which there was twice in the first 2 months, it was handled the way disagreements between people who respect each other are handled. Clearly, without performance, with the actual substance addressed rather than managed around. She noted all of it, not in the document, in her own understanding of what she had seen, which was that the things Nathan Cole had said in that conference room about how he operated had turned out to be the things he actually did. This remained, in her experience, rarer than it should be. Jeffrey Harmon sent one more email in the second month. It was shorter than the first. It mentioned that they had made some changes to their client engagement protocols. The language was general. It did not specify what had changed or why the change had been made. It ended with a professional wish for her success. She read it once, then she archived it. She did not think about it again for a long time. What she thought about, in the months that followed, was something her father had said when she was 17, and considering whether to stay in the small town and help with the hardware store or leave for the city and the university that had accepted her. He had said that leaving was not disloyalty. He had said that the point of building something was not to keep it small. The point of building something was to make it the best version of what it could be, and sometimes the best version required going somewhere larger. He had been talking about her. But it was also, she understood now, what he believed about the store. He had not wanted her to stay small on his behalf. He had wanted her to go and build the largest version of herself she could manage. She had tried. She was still trying. $500 million was not the end of anything. It was, like every other milestone she had reached, simply the current version of the work. The work continued. It would always continue. That was not a burden. That was the point. On a Tuesday in the 4th month of the partnership, she received a message from an analyst on Nathan's team. It was flagged as non-urgent. It was a note about a sector she had not been watching closely, flagging an early signal that her own team had not yet identified. It was not her money that was directly affected. It was useful information. She forwarded it to her senior analyst. Her analyst called her 10 minutes later and said, "Where did this come from?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good partner." She said yes. She closed the message. She opened the next thing on her list. She worked through the afternoon in the steady, focused way she had always worked, which was the same at 43 as it had been at 29. And at 17 behind the counter of a hardware store in a small town, telling herself things about the future that had not yet arrived. She had not been wrong about most of them. Outside her window, the city moved through its afternoon, indifferent and continuous and full, as always, of people making decisions they would have to live with. She was at peace with hers. She had been, she realized, since the moment she walked out of the building on the 43rd floor and found the elevator already waiting. The coffee she had left on the table was cold by then. She had left it because she was precise about such things. What she left behind and what she took with her were never accidents. They never had been.